As students, in this video we're going to look at how to use the measures of spread to describe and compare data. Right, so after watching this video you should be able to define the main measures of spread, so range, interquartile range and standard deviation, and then you should be able to determine the range and interquartile range of a data set by hand. Right, the biggest thing to remember here, students, is how to find the median score. So the median score is just the n plus 1 divided by 2. Right, that number score in our if we've got n data points. Remember, if we've got a half in our answer, then that means it'll be the average of the two numbers either side of that score. Alright, so guys, on their own, measures of center can only tell part of a story when it comes to describing a data set. So looking at these two examples, we've got set A and set B. They have a mean of 28 and a median of 26. But the thing is, they are very different sets of data. Set A is much more consistent, just going between 18 and 39, but set B varies a lot more, going all the way between 7 and 54. So measures of spread indicate how much variation or how much spread there is between the data points in the set. Now, the lower the value of this measure of spread, the less spread out the data is. Or if we put that another way, the higher the value of your measure of spread, the more spread out, the more varied, the more unpredictable your data is. Whereas the lower the measure of spread, the more consistent the data is, the easier it is to predict. That's generally how we look at our measures of spread. High values of spread means very spread out, very inconsistent. Smaller values of spread means it's more consistent, more predictable. Right, the simplest measure of spread is the range. The range is just the highest score, take the lowest score. So if we've got an example here, we want to determine the range of our two data sets. Well, looking at those two, the highest score of A is 8, well, the lowest score is 18, the highest is 39. The lowest score of set B is 7, the highest is 54. So subtracting those, our ranges are 21 and 47. So looking at those two scores, set A is definitely much less spread out because it's got a lower measure of spread. Now, when we're talking about interquartile range, it's important we understand what quartiles are first. So spread can be analysed by breaking down into smaller parts, right? And usually that's quarters, or more regularly called quartiles. So Q1 is the score for the first quartile, and it's basically the median of the lower half of data. So if you think about it, you've got the lower half of data. If you're finding the middle of the lower half, you're splitting it into quarters. So for that lower end of data, that median is going to basically break up our first quarter and our second quarter. The second quartile is better known as the median, right? It's halfway in our data, marking the halfway point, and it's in the middle. The third quartile is the median of the upper half. So if we have the upper half of our data, the third quartile is the middle number of that upper half of our data. Very wordy, but we'll go through and explain an example. Now, the interquartile range is similar to the range, but it's just the difference between the third and first quarters, the third and first quartiles. Basically, it just indicates how spread out the middle 50% is. The range tells us how spread out the whole 100% of our data is. The interquartile range tells us how spread out is our middle 50%. Right, so looking at some examples here, we're going to find the interquartile range of these two data sets. So we'll do A first. Now, we've already said the median, in this case, is going to be the fifth score. Right, so there's 9 data points, counting them up, adding 1 is 10, divided by 2 is 5. So counting our data points, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So our median is 26, which we already knew. Now, for our first quartile and our third quartile, they both only have 4 numbers in them. So we won't count the median, but looking below our median, we've got 4 numbers, and looking above our median, we've got 4 numbers too. So the middle of those values, so 4 numbers plus 1 is 5, divided by 2 is the 2.5, the score. So counting them along, 1, 2. Our first quarter will be smack bang between 21 and 21. Our third quartile will be smack bang between 1, 2, 35 and 36. It's taking the lower half, finding the middle, taking the upper half, finding the middle. So in this case, our first quartile is 21, smack bang in between 21 and 21. Our upper quartile will be the average of 35 and 36, which is 35.5. Now finally, our interquartile range is just the difference between those two values. So the difference between our quartiles of 35.5 and 21 is just 14.5. Doing the same sort of thing for B, our median is 26. Our first quartile will be in between 12 and 13, so that's 12.5. Our other middle score will be in between 39 and 47. So the average of 39 and 47 is 43. So that's our third quartile. And our interquartile range is the difference, IQR, interquartile range, is the difference between those two values, 45 and 12.5, which is 30.5. And once again, we can see we've got a low interquartile range for our first set of data and a high interquartile range for our second, saying that this second lot of data is much more spread out, whereas this first set of data, lower interquartile range, again, not as spread out. Finally, standard deviation is basically a measure of how far the data points are from the mean in this case. So interquartile range largely works with the median, right? And quartiles, standard deviation works with the mean, and it's basically a measure of how far away the data points are from the mean. So looking at this one here, the standard deviation of set A is 7.79, so a small value, especially compared with set B, which is 16.34. So set B has a much higher standard deviation, so it's much more spread out, compared to set A with a smaller standard deviation. It's much more consistent. So in all our measures of spread, we can see that set A is much less spread out. It's much more consistent than set B, which has a lot of variation and has a lot of spread. Right, so after watching this video, you should be able to define the main measures of spread, range, interquartile range, and standard deviation, and you should also be able to determine the range and interquartile set of a data set.